Al Jazeera has been barred from covering the GCC summit in Bahrain. The government hasn't given a reason for the ban, but why was the network singled out? And should there be a common rule for journalists covering international events? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Now, the 6 countries that make up the Gulf Cooperation Council are vital regional and international players. They are Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Kuwait and Bahrain. And when their leaders hold their annual summit, it makes news around the world. But this year, Al Jazeera has been banned from covering the summit in the Bahraini capital, Manama. That's despite submitting the required paperwork on time. In a statement, Al Jazeera said the network had prepared for special, comprehensive coverage of this important event. Al Jazeera condemns this measure, which is a deviation from the normal media protocols of host countries, and affirms that it'll continue to cover news and events in Bahrain regardless of this ban. The government of Bahrain has tried to prevent Al Jazeera from covering many stories over the years, especially in 2011. That's when the government cracked down on Arab Spring-inspired protests in Manama. Hundreds of people were jailed and dozens killed. In March of that year, the GCC countries sent in troops to help put down the protests. Sectarian tensions have worsened since then. Bahrain is ruled by a Sunni family, but most citizens are Shia. And Iran has criticised the ruling family for allegedly mistreating the Shia majority, especially after authorities shut down a Shia opposition group and stripped a top Shia cleric of his citizenship in June. Well, let's bring in our guests. Here in Doha, we have Al Jazeera correspondent Jamal Al-Shayal, who was barred from covering the summit in Manama. In Vienna, Barbara Trionfi, Executive Director of the International Press Institute. And in Oxford, Hugh Miles, journalist and author of the book Al Jazeera, How Arab TV News Challenged the World. Very warm welcome to all of you. Let me start off with you, Jamal. What happened?
Well, Jane, as you said, or as Al Jazeera mentioned in the statement, we had submitted all the required paperwork. We had filled in the applications to attend, which is the norm. You apply for accreditation for any international event. And we did that a while back, actually, in November. And then we went to, I flew into Manama with my passport and filled in a landing card. In it, it asks what your job occupation is and the reason for the visit. So we weren't hiding anything. We was a written correspondent or journalist and coming to cover the GCC summit. I was then asked by an immigration officer to take a seat and wait for a while. I waited for about 15-20 minutes. Then he came back and he said, unfortunately, you're not allowed entry. I said, why is that? He said, well, the Ministry of Information says that Al Jazeera is persona non grata in Bahrain. I said, what's the reason? We've applied. And he said, well, the Ministry of Information claims that you haven't submitted the correct paperwork on time. I said, well, this isn't true because I've actually printed them out and they're with me. He said, unfortunately, this is out of my hands. And then he escorted me on to a flight back to Doha.
And you think you would have been told this in November when you first submitted the papers, but you've been here before, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very bizarre situation because firstly, because we were never, when we applied, there was no rejection that came to us. And secondly, because this is an international conference, we're not going to cover Bahrain stories in the sense that it's not about internal events. This is your host nation where you're hosting international countries. It is an international news event.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're hardly going to be able to scuttle off and do something that
Of course not. I mean, we were going there. Like I said, everything was above board. As journalists, we're doing everything. It is an international conference. There's nothing to hide from it. Anyway, news agencies are there and so forth. It appears that as far as the Bahraini authorities are concerned, they were not interested in Al Jazeera viewers being able to see what was taking place, or at least for Al Jazeera journalists to have that ability to do their work.
I mean, the irony is that Al Jazeera is still getting live feeds from the summit, so Al Jazeera and those who watch Al Jazeera know very well what's happening in that summit.
Precisely, and that's the bizarre thing, and it's also a dangerous thing where internal or countries' politics then gets mixed with press freedoms in that respect. The fact of the matter is, as you mentioned, we're still covering the story, and we are getting pictures, and we have been rolling on the important statements that world leaders have been making. But because Bahrain wants to, or possibly the government has some sort of political agenda, it's taken it out on the journalists rather than on politicians. Now it's totally...
So sorry, is the focus here, or is the victim here Al Jazeera, do you think, or Qatar? Because I know that Bahrain views Al Jazeera as a political tool of Qatar. I mean, is that what's happening here?
The true victim is the viewer who is being denied a specific source of information, or there's an attempt to deny the viewer of it. In reality, what appears to be the case is that Bahrain has an issue with Qatar, but it's taken out on Al Jazeera. Now, Al Jazeera is not a state television. Also, what's even more ironic is Qatar State TV is in Manama. So the issue appears to be that they have something with Al Jazeera's journalism, or whether they have something with regards to Qatar politics. Both those situations, one is worse than the other. If you've got an issue with Al Jazeera journalism, then you can tell us where we've gone wrong professionally. But if you don't have that evidence, that's why you will then go on to draconian measures or an attempt to muzzle. If it's a political issue, then again, it's got nothing to do with us. That's something that should be dealt with politicians. As journalists, we're going to cover something, and that's it.
And regardless of whether Al Jazeera is being seen as being linked to the Qatari government or not, I should imagine that this is going to leave a bad taste in the Qatari group's team there on the ground. How do you think this will be playing out there, and what sort of impact will it have on the GCC as a whole?
I mean, I'll tell you something, Jane. What's significant about this as well, as you alluded to in the intro, is that when it comes to international conferences, host nations for international conferences do not bring in their bilateral politics to it. So what I mean by that is when the UN General Assembly takes place, for example, in New York, you will have journalists from North Korea, you'll have journalists from Iran or other countries that the US might not even have diplomatic relations with, but they're going there because this is an international and you're a host nation. This is not the Bahrain Economic Conference. This is the GCC Summit, which is an international one. When you bring in the politics, you've unfortunately degraded the level or the significance of this conference and made it something about you as a country. That's the problem. Now, how that plays out, obviously, from a political perspective, I'm sure behind closed doors there are stern words that will be said from one side to another. But from as far as we're concerned, and I'm sure we'll hear this from our guests, our concern isn't how it plays out politics, it is how it's going to play out from a press freedom perspective. And that's what should be highlighted here. If you have an issue with our professionalism, if you have an issue with the way we work, then call us out on it, discuss it. But to ban, firstly, is futile because, as we mentioned, we're still going to report from there. But also, it's a very dangerous sign in terms of your willingness to accept a view and a different point of view.
Politics that we did see at play, Theresa May, the new British Prime Minister, she was there. It seems that she's aligning herself very closely to the GCC while walking away from the EU. What was her message there?
Well, I mean, she's got a lot in common with the Gulf countries. As we said before, obviously, she is the first female Prime Minister. I mean, the fact is she wasn't elected to be Prime Minister, so her mandate there is very strange in the sense that she is coming to reshape British foreign policy post-Brexit in an attempt to find a new source of economic security. She made it very clear, she said in her statement, that she didn't want anybody to have any doubt as to how ambitious she was with regards to GCC-UK relationship. That's all based on an already existing relationship, which is fundamentally one that's fundamentally based on security. The GCC looks to the UK for security, buys planes, weaponry, as well as obviously in Manama, there's one of the biggest British naval bases there. What Theresa May is trying to do now, what she said is she's looking to expand that. She needs to create possibly tariff-free trade with the GCC to look for an alternative post-Brexit. She's seeing maybe that the GCC will be something that's interesting, but her visit hasn't come without controversy. She's had a lot of opponents in the UK condemning her visit to Bahrain because of press freedoms and because of freedoms there, and that's something that she'll have to deal with as well.
Okay, let's leave it there. Jamal El-Shal, thank you very much. And let's go straight to our guests in Vienna and Oxford. Barbara Trionfi, what is your response to what happened to Al Jazeera at the summit?
Well, IPI has condemned this. Already yesterday in a statement we said that these are administrative, is a form of administrative censorship that is being imposed on Al Jazeera, and we find it absolutely unacceptable. On the other hand, unfortunately, it happens, and it happens far too often. Jamal before mentioned that the host countries of international events should not decide who can or cannot participate, in particular with regard to journalists and journalists who go there to cover the event. And I fully agree with that position. But unfortunately, this is very often what happens. And this is something that has affected many of our members, many journalists around the world. And it also affected IPI itself whenever we make effort to bring journalists together.
So journalists and media organizations should be viewed as exactly the same, regardless of where they come from, regardless of the political pressures that they might have on them.
Absolutely. I mean, they should be viewed exactly the same. And further to that, I mean, there are international standards that guarantee access to information of public relevance, of public interest, and this is of course independent from the nationality or any other aspect of the journalist or of the media organizations. The standards are there, the principles are there, and IPI has often reiterated them, but unfortunately they are much too often disregarded. And this final event, and this what happened yesterday in Bahrain, is yet another proof that we have yet to find a way to ensure respect for international press freedom standards.
Hugh Miles, what is your response?
Well, it's a bit unusual for Bahrain to ban Al Jazeera English. I mean, in the past, the Gulf countries have tended to target the Arab stations because it's the Arab stations that obviously have the most impact on their own citizens. So there's certainly a question mark about why Bahrain has done this. And, you know, as your correspondent said, it's a really self-defeating move because it simply draws attention to the fact that Bahrain is an autocratic, secretive state like the other states in the GCC. So it brings unwanted attention, and it raises the question, what are they hiding? Why don't they want Al Jazeera journalists to go?
Okay,
Is it
well,
because of the war
you
in
know
Yemen?
the country, you know the region, you know Al Jazeera very well, you've written a book about it. What do you think they are concerned about, and what is it that they fear that Al Jazeera might be able to get that possibly nobody else might?
Well, I think that the GCC countries generally are secretive, corrupt, autocratic, and they fear freedom of expression and freedom of assembly because they have very restive populations, especially Bahrain, which is been on the verge of a revolution now for some years. And they're very concerned that Al Jazeera is going to stoke these embers up into a fire. And now, with the low oil price, they are in a panic about their situation. There's a feeling across the GCC that maybe the ship is beginning to sink. They are engaged in a war in Yemen that is a public relations and humanitarian disaster. So there's plenty of things they have to hide. There's human rights abuses, there's enormous corruption in defense procurement and other areas. So there's plenty of things that the Bahrainis and other GCC countries would rather not be open to public scrutiny.
Barbara, is that what it's all about? There's just too much to hide in Bahrain and possibly this region as a whole?
No, I fully agree. Yes, there is possibly too much to hide. There is a great degree of intolerance toward any form of criticism, even in the form of simply independent reporting. And what Al Jazeera has that many of the other news organizations that were granted access to the event is audiences. Al Jazeera English has and Arabic, of course, has a huge audience. They have a huge reach. And they have also a name for, like, they're known for speaking up in defense of human rights and against violations of human rights. So absolutely, yes.
Remind us of what the impact is once you start clamping down on press freedom and where it leaves society, freedom of speech.
We see a downward trend when you start clamping down on press freedom, because it seems that the more you clamp down on press freedom, the more there is a perception that the government has something to hide, and the more the government will be criticized. And in the moment they are criticized, then they are reactive in an even more authoritative and autocratic way, and restrict fundamental rights even more. The problem is that if people are not able to express opinions freely through normal channel, they will find ways to express them differently, occasionally even through violence. And that's where we believe the lack of press freedom will eventually lead.
Hugh?
Well, indeed, I agree with your other guest, absolutely. And I mean, of course, the internet is now a major outlet because, I mean, in fairness to the GCC countries, there has been an improvement, a big improvement in the media in the last 20 years since Al Jazeera was launched. And there has been an opening up in the Saudi media now, for example. You do see debates about social issues. And this has come about not because the Saudi government supports freedom of speech, but simply because they have no alternative. Because of the internet, and particularly Twitter, they have lost control of the media sphere, and in order that the public or the government media stays relevant, there has to be some relaxation of the rules. But these countries control freedom of speech and freedom of association very closely. Of course, there's very limited press freedom across the GCC. Qatar is an exception in that respect. But particularly I'm thinking about Saudi Arabia and Bahrain because they're in a very fragile situation. Bahrain depends wholly on Saudi Arabia for financial and political support. Saudi Arabia depends wholly on the West for political support. And if this arrangement should change, then the whole show could easily come tumbling down. And this is the risk that these countries now are faced with real existential problems to do with the oil price, the war in Yemen, the human rights situation, the terrorism campaigns, succession problems, particularly in Saudi Arabia. So they are, frankly, in a white-knuckle panic about their future. And they are trying to keep the show on the road using every lever at their control. And that means the military, that means the religious authorities issuing edicts to try and bolster their legitimacy. And it means cracking down on the media, imprisoning journalists, banning journalists from entering the country. And these are desperate measures, but these are desperate times.
Barbara, I'm just wondering what you make of Theresa May's presence there at the summit and some of the comments that she made about the region's reforms and applauding their reforms. Does this do any damage to your work?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, human rights groups and press freedom organizations ahead of Theresa May's trip to Bahrain urged her to raise human rights concerns during her participation in the GCC summit, which she committed to do. However, unfortunately, it is absolutely clear that concerns on human rights are not prioritized over a trade deal to boost UK export, which at the moment is fundamental for the UK. And on top of it, I'm terribly worried about the ongoing cooperation between the UK and GCC countries to counter terrorism. Countering terrorism means adopting also, methods of surveillance which should be used against terrorists, but unfortunately that many governments many repressive governments also use to monitor human rights defenders and pro-democracy activists, and amongst them independent journalists. So I'm very worried that the ongoing cooperation between the UK and the GCC in this area will eventually lead to the GCC countries developing tools that will put human rights defenders in these countries under even greater pressure. And the fact that Theresa May is 100% behind this process and is not questioning UK's involvement in this direction is absolutely worrying in terms of international standards and in terms of the ability of the international community to stand up in defense of principles we have agreed upon, which are human rights principles.
Hugh, I'm sure you've got something to say about Theresa May. And we also hear at the same time that the British think tank, the IISS, which is the International Institute for Strategic Studies, has been taking money from Bahrain. You got this at the same time that Theresa May is there. Everyone's talking about freedom of speech. I mean, where does this leave repression, particularly when it comes to the media and people living in those areas affected by a muzzled press?
Well, I mean, this is called the Saudi lobby. The Saudis are bankrolling Bahrain, which is bankrolling IISS, and the Saudis control huge armies of lobbyists, media organizations, lawyers, many other people in society, because they are trying to sustain themselves. And Theresa May is quite willing, obviously, to buy into this because she is trying to forge new trade relationships in the wake of Brexit, and she sees the Gulf as a good place to go because they have a lot of money, and so she can do business with them. Is it ethical? No, it's not ethical. Should she be continuing to sell weapons to the Saudis and the Bahrainis when they are dropping these bombs on Yemen and causing a humanitarian crisis? No, of course she shouldn't. But this is real politique, and so this is her reason to be there. And again, this is why they don't want Al Jazeera and other independently minded media organisations in Bahrain asking these difficult questions and shaking up this cosy relationship.
Barbara, we might never get to the bottom of why Al Jazeera was stopped from entering Bahrain again. And as you mentioned a little earlier, you know, even the United Nations regulates who attend some of their press conferences. How do you get people to be enthusiastic about putting a stop to these kind of practices in the international community?
I think that you don't get people to be enthusiastic. You don't get certain governments to be enthusiastic about stopping these practices, but you must. What we must do is to get governments who do not agree with these type of practices to speak up, and also in spite of possible other political and trade deals that they may have with autocratic countries, there is the need for a much stronger global movement in defense of these practices, because otherwise, if this is not being done, eventually this will turn against democratic countries, will turn against those countries that have failed to speak up now. So this is what IPI is trying to do, to mobilize international pressure and to mobilize international diplomacy in order to really ensure that even those who believe they can limit access eventually are shamed if they do that.
Okay, and Hugh, I mean, what do you recommend be done? If you look at, you know, Egypt's a case in point of journalists increasingly disappearing. What should be done?
The Arab countries have got the media under control, more or less, because they have no qualms about human rights, and they can obviously imprison and kill and torture at liberty, and they do in large numbers. The solution lies in the Western publics, because Western countries are democracies, and the GCC know that, and this is why they fear public opinion in the West, because they know that if Al Jazeera and other media outlets can inform the Western audiences about what these countries are really like, and if they can tell the truth and defy the lobbies who try and whitewash their reputations, then the Western public will be outraged, and they will put
Hugh,
pressure
I'm
on their
afraid
governments
we've run out of time.
to change their policies.
It's a big topic. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Big topic, little time. Barbara Triunfi and Hugh Miles, thank you very much. Thank you as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, please go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Jane Dutton, and the whole team here, goodbye.